Hello and welcome to the ATARC webinar series. Today we'll be discussing the intersection of IVN, the Integrated Value Network, and AI, artificial intelligence, with the ATARC Growing Good in Government Working Group leadership panel, and also including Tony Bosey and Ken Farber. My name is Bill Bunce. I am the industry chair for the ATARC Growing Good in Government Working Group, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's webinar. ATARC stands for the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center. ATARC is an organization that facilitates the collaboration between government, industry, and academia in order to accelerate technology modernization initiatives. ATARC provides ongoing opportunities for cross-agency collaboration through on-site interaction, learning, and market research. This afternoon, we're going to hear from our panelists, followed by a Q&A. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please put them in the Q&A function in Zoom below. I'd like to now introduce our panelists, and if you could just wave your hand when I call out your name. First, we have Paul Quimby. Paul is a program analyst with the Department of Interior. Next, we have Basil White. Basil is a senior informaticist with USDA APHIS. Next, we have Tony Bosey. Tony is a research program manager and associate researcher at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. And finally, we have Ken Farber. Ken is a director of solutions at Tech Synap. We're going to kick things off with Basil, and Basil is going to give us kind of a baseline discussion of the IVN data. Basil, over to you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone, for joining. So let's begin at the beginning. So today's agenda is we're going to talk about the Integrated Value Network, which is a tool to help us manage what we know about requirements, so a requirements management tool. We're going to talk about how we use it to structure unstructured data about various kinds of requirements, laws, regulations, executive orders, directives, plans, measures, and we're gonna ask you to help us try to answer two questions. How can AI assist helping us structure unstructured data, not just for this program, but in general with the mass of unstructured data out there in the government, and how can we adapt our business processes to accommodate what AI can do to help us improve our service to citizens. Okay. So more specifically, the Integrated Value Network is a knowledge management tool. It's in the data side of it. It's a relational database, and it depicts federal policy as a neural network with the U.S. Constitution as the root node of that network of requirements. So users can query the Integrated Value Network for a directive, a regulation, a strategic plan, performance measure, or a department priority, and they can see how all of those different sources of requirements supply and demand value to each other across the network. So the database represents these linkages across legislation, regulations, plans, policies, programs, performance measures, and because we've linked these requirements from these documents in a knowledge base, that data becomes a basis of evidence for justifying budgets, identifying operational gaps in legislative requirements, and organizing various cross-cutting activities. Basically, what's everything we're doing about something the president wanted, or now that we have a sense of everything that we do to deliver on a priority, how can we collaborate to add more value to that priority? Or what's the gap between the catalog of all the services we provide for some objective, and what's the difference between the network we have and the network we want? So we have 6 IVN belt ranks. It's similar to the rank system that's used for Lean Six Sigma. Out of all the currently active, we have 9 white belts, 8 yellow, 7 green, 5 red. We have some people who just started the brown and black belt dojo. We're going to have a few interns coming up this fall, and they're going to be working through these steps as well. So in the context of the integrated value network, using artificial intelligence tools could do two things. They could enhance these business processes and functions, and they could actually perform the role of performing those functions themselves. And I'll walk through those real quick. So the first thing we want to do is we take a governance document, like a new strategic plan, and we crack it out into individual requirements that we can deliver on. And once we do that inventory, that's the old belt thing, we take pairs of those, let's say a strategic plan and a policy, and we find how delivering the policy delivers on items in the strategic plan. Then we get to the red belt piece. Once we do those crosswalks, we figure out how to add those alignments of requirements into a network. So we put it into our data set, and then we do that QC. And then once you start getting to brown and black belt, you start being able to run it as your own program. So you'd be able to assign and manage the inventories and crosswalks that you need to generate the body of evidence to support a new piece of policy or a strategy in keeping with the requirements of the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. And then, how to close out those analysis products, and then how to start it all from scratch, close the life cycle, have an initial meeting with clients who want to build evidence-based policy. So that's the skills ladder. And we feel that applying artificial intelligence tools to these tasks would enhance those processes and functions. I mean, we still need people to master the concepts and skills, and we always will. But using a well-trained AI tool would help them collect information faster and make these quality reviews much more efficient. And we think the insights generated by AI can adapt its learning to help the analysts find new insights and improve performance. And this is the business processes and functions. This is really hard to read. I've got a close up in the next slide. So this starts up at the beginning, upper left. The client determines that they have to create a new governance document, policy plan, program, and the new work. We gather those requirements, and you move down this process, and then we make recommendations which get implemented into a new piece of governance. But I'm going to show you okay. So this is the beginning. So we get a request for a new research project, or the feasibility of one. We identify that document the client has to create. We figure out the gap between what's the network of requirements that they have, policies, plans, programs, and the network they want to deliver. And then we get a set of governance documents. What are we going to read that has the requirements that we need to crack apart to look at to make some evidence-based recommendations to make new policy? Then we do that. We do the crosswalks. We figure out the alignments. We build that ecosystem of the requirements that represent the inputs and outputs of value for a governance document, and we make our recommendations. And this is where we get toward the end. I'm just explaining the end of it. So we have business processes, which are boxes and arrows that go through, and then we have some functions that are more holistic, that operate, across the multiple boxes in the functions. Let's see. And subject to your questions, I think we're going to gather Q&A at the end. But really, what I want to leave you with is I want to talk to about, like we said, how AI could possibly enhance business processes like this, where we're trying to structure unstructured data, but in also ways in which we can trust AI. Maybe perhaps trusting AI generated content by limiting AI to increasing our trust in our human generated content, which we have now. Subject to your questions, that's all I have for now. Of course, we'll answer any of your questions in the Q&A. I'll pass it over to you, Bill. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Basil. Why don't we turn it over to you, Paul? Paul, if you could kind of discuss the problem or problems that we're trying to solve, and maybe next steps.
Sure. Thanks, Bill. Thank you all for attending today. Baz did a great job of outlining, the process as it exists today. And it's a very manual process. You could imagine, building the IVN, the Integrated Value Network, and it takes an analyst to look at many documents on one side as, source documents, whether they're dependent or enabling, and then on the other side, and then finding the linkages in those documents, doing the crosswalk, finding components in one document that would link to another document, and then in a very time-intensive manual way, build out the IVN, which that governance framework. And AI seems like a really natural way of facilitating, expediting, improving that process to have natural language processing find those crosswalks, to do that crosswalk for us, find other non-obvious linkages between source documents, whether they're enabling or dependent sources, finding language that indicates that it would be a good fit in one document and relate that to another document, and do that very fast, very efficiently, and then keep the human in the loop to evaluate whether the quality of that crosswalk, the quality of the linkage is where it needs to be, and continually improve that process. So we think that natural language processing really in AI tools and capabilities would really facilitate that kind of work and leave the human to do real value added work. Another AI capability that we think is addressed or could be addressed in this process is actually parsing documents for us, finding documents. You can imagine that the Code of Federal Regulations, which is this vast repository of governance documents, governance components, governance things that would make up and go into the IVN, would correspond to a lot of our other documents that we have. And turning AI tools loose on that to parse it and find non-obvious linkages to other documents like strategic plans or policy documents in any department, any agency that would be related to that. Doing the same thing with US code. So AI really has some vast potential for us in that regard. And finally, one of the other things that we think would benefit from AI in this realm is chatbot or generative AI, putting that to work for us to kind of limit the structure of a chatbot or generative AI tools toward developing IVN, answering frequently asked questions, doing the kind of grunt work that, ChatGPT or some of the other government-focused chatbots can do, but using generative AI in really creative ways to help us sort through and provide a repository of questions that can be asked and then answered in a real-time fashion. So I think, we're in a brave new world, brave new horizons for where AI can help us in this. And I'll turn it back to you, Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Well, what I'd like to do is pull Tony into the conversation. So I didn't mention during the introduction that Tony is joining us from the ATARC AI working group. And so Tony, based on what we learned from Basil and what we're hoping are some of the benefits of AI, Tony, what are your thoughts as an AI practitioner about feasibility and so on? Some lessons learned for us.
Sure. So I think it's a great tool. I've looked at it now for a while. I've had several meetings with these fine folks, both outside of the context of this meeting and in the context of the session. I don't foresee any massive hurdles to deployment, particularly with the relatively careful and point-by-point deployment strategy that you have. You're not doing big fast. You're training the trainers to make sure that there's a good diffusion of people who know what's going on and how to use it. So I think it's just going to be a good thing. I believe it could be democratizing in a certain way, particularly when we come to making sure that statutes, laws, and regs are navigable and understandable and other things to maybe a more average person, which I think is good. Some functions that I see that it could do either now or very near, which I would suggest looking into if not already. One is kind of what I just touched on, using it to not only just identify documents and identify the leakages among documents, but also possibly make translated versions of documents for different expertise levels or possibly even different areas of focus. I know we talk about informed consent, for instance, in the VHA, and we think about how to get informed consent out of people when we're discussing with them AI models that might be used in their diagnosis or care. One of the big things is having model cards where we boil down the function and process of the model into a very accessible size. and then translate that 3 ways, one for, the average patient at maybe like an 8th grade level, one for a doctor or other expert who is not an AI expert, and then one for like the actual like Q&A AI person who's going to deal with the model in a rigorous sense. So maybe doing something like that for policy could be cool. I like the idea that it could be used to chase precedent, which I think was touched on, right? Being able to pierce, I get a memo and I get to go see what EO spun up that memo, and maybe I go get to see what piece of draft legislation led to that EO, or what sort of presidential management or strategy point led to that EO, or possibly get up to the EO and be able to pan sideways. I didn't quite catch if this is something that's in there yet, but I think it's a place where you're going, where I can also then see like how it crosswalks to maybe what the EO's got going on, or Singapore, or Aotearoa, or Canada, or the other countries that are doing a good job with AI. So those are all good. Things that I would point you to suggest, my last point, like ways to go forward. There is a technology out of the Navy called Monterey Phoenix. Its PI is Kristen Giamarco out of the Naval Postgraduate School. It is a easy to use code that will scan processes or behavioral patterns to find opportunities for aberration, or like infinite loops that you accidentally create, or dead ends that you might accidentally create, or in your case have discovered. So maybe Monterey Phoenix could help lay over your tech and speed up some of that. And then I think this was kind of touched on, talking about using generative AI to like find gaps in artifacts. I think it'd be cool to take it to the next step and see if you can do some sort of like LLM document imputation to, like, if you find a gap, see what sort of document would be necessary to fill that gap. Like if there's like a chain of legal logic from a thing to a thing to a thing, and then there's a gap, like seeing what that document might look like, and then possibly even going so far as to then figuring out in a scan if that document exists. And if it doesn't, then maybe you've done a great service and found some form of interesting gap in how policies or laws layer over, and maybe you might have found something that needs like legitimate fixing, perhaps urgently, perhaps legally. So I think that'd be a really cool way to not only just do the democratization thing, but actually start correcting the system that you're analyzing. That's all I got for now. I look forward to the Q&A at the end. Back to you, Bill.
Great. Thanks, Tony. Well, what I'd like to do is pull in Ken Farber. Ken is also from the ATARC AI working group, but he is from industry. So up to this point, we've heard kind of from the government what they're doing, what they're trying to do moving forward, beginning to work with AI. Ken, what are your thoughts on what we've been discussing so far?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I've been looking forward to applying NLP in this way for a while, and I think there could be a tremendous service, like Tony mentioned, of sifting through the sort of chain of custody from all the way from the Constitution through the actually laws that are actually passed and specific terms and conditions in those laws down to the CFR, and then actual deploying practices through agencies. So I think there could be tremendous value here. I'm wondering if at what point would you need to reference an authority to do this? Say you do exactly what Tony just said, and you you follow that chain and you find this gap, and you identify a gap, you identify something where there really ought to be some explanatory or supporting material. Who has the authority, and what type of authority is it that lets you create that gap, create that gap filling mechanism? So I do think it's a tremendously valuable approach. One thing, I guess, two things, I guess, I would caution about the use, and so I see maybe a little bit more of I wouldn't call it a barrier, but it's certainly something to consider. The first one is to take a look at the use of these tools in such a way that you don't assume that the body of governance documents you're looking at is consistent, right? So you can't have it say give it a prompt that assumes implicitly that everything is consistent and fine. In fact, your prompt and the way you use the system might have to be there might have to be a type of pre-processing where you make sure the thing that you're looking at is validated and treated in the governance documents, and then go and ask the following questions. The other concern, and this is there's a research, I think, element to this, and that is that most LLMs that are being used in generative AI systems treat all the incoming data, all the training data that they use to train themselves on, they treat it all equally. So it's a very democratic process. So that's why in the early days, you ran into these problems of the generative AI system telling you that using glue is a good way to hold fixings on pizza. So you've got to be careful about looking at that, because in this case, in this application, the governance documents have a specific hierarchy. Some actually do have a higher authority than the other documents. And I would imagine there's a design consideration where you want to make sure that the results reflect that hierarchy. And I haven't looked at the recent research, but I don't believe that the current models have that consideration. Again, I think that the training data used for these large models is all treated pretty equally. And they rely on putting in guardrails and post-processing to filter out the obviously inaccurate or misleading generated information. So there are things to consider, but again, I'm as a policy geek, I really like the idea of being able to establish and follow, a cognitive path throughout from the highest level to the lowest level, implementation level of the policy. So thanks very much for sharing that, and I'm looking forward to what you're going to do next.
Thanks, Ken. Appreciate it. Well, let's transition here. We have a few minutes left for questions. One question that came in was from Kirk. Thank you for the question around qualifying, how to qualify in budget dollars the benefit. So I'm assuming using AI to calculate expected benefit. Basil, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. Thank you. I did type a response, but I want to talk about it too. So the IVN can, and we have some, and I have some at least anecdotal examples of how it does save money in terms of in terms of people, budgets, and things. For one thing, it's reduced the response time it takes us to respond to data calls. In the past, working with working with the IVN. I've worked in an office that had very open-ended questions from the White House and the Senate about what are you doing about X? Well, historically, that's just lights up the building, and all the 13s and 14s run around and they try to answer the questions, and it turns into an essay. And it's a very expensive, useful body of knowledge that dies on the vine because we haven't had a place to manage that knowledge. But so not only are we reusing it, but it reduces that response time. I mean, we were doing some responses to those questions instead of 4 days, it would take us about 90 minutes because we had confidence that by querying this database and the way it was structured and how we built it, we had confidence that we could say this is 95% of everything that the department has that delivers on that topic or subject. It also maps accountability to laws and regulations. So we have like 2 SC 388, you can find everything that you do that delivers on 2 USC 388, plans, policy, people, money, things, budgets, offices, that sort of thing. So you can measure the cost of compliance for specific regulations or maybe executive orders, which means that you can measure the potential savings that you would get from legislative relief from legislative proposals. And in terms of money, this isn't savings, but it's maybe resilience, budget resilience. It makes stronger justifications for people, money, and things because you have the benefit of a rather broad library of all the requirements that relate to each other. And it's historically most of the justifications when someone brings us a program or a project like some sort of governance document they want to create, or they just want to know how this governance document fits in everything else. More than 50%, sometimes 90%, most of the justifications we find from their program to the laws and regulations that program helps us comply with, most of them are unknown to the program owners, which means that when we're all in a room with our boss fighting over the same nickel, people who have access to a broad holistic library of all the requirements their program might deliver on have a significant competitive advantage of this broad basis of evidence of how their program delivers on requirements up, down, across the department and up through the requirements of the White House and regulation and law. Thank you. Good question.
Thanks, Basil. So in the Q&A, Nabila provided several really good examples of, where AI is useful and so on. Paul, maybe I could turn to you and you could talk about some examples of where you're using IVN at Department of Interior.
Well, we're very immature in our use of IVN relative to VA and USDA, but I would like to link, I think, this to the previous question too about budget, and not just in terms of dollars, but finding value. And so I think that the IVN and that concept becomes very useful when we're dealing with cross-agency types of things. Baz didn't talk about it, but an example that is in USDA could be feral swine, for example, as an invasive species. And it would be really interesting to discover what other bureaus, offices in a cross-agency world or, in a cross-agency way are dealing with invasive species like feral swine, or having to deal with something near and dear to USDA's heart like African swine flu. And how do you respond, and how do you do a whole of government type of response to those kinds of issues? The IVN provides a mechanism for facilitating and accelerating those decisions, finding the gaps, if you will, in policy and governance, trying to fill those gaps, I think, as Tony talked about, would be really interesting. But you can't put a budget measure on, or a quantitative dollar amount on that kind of insight. But that's valuable nevertheless, because we can figure out what DOI is doing. How could we leverage what USDA is doing and Commerce is doing, what other organizations are doing with respect to domain X? And then you can magnify the power of whatever each agency brings to that particular domain and capitalize on successes, minimize risks, and try to build on doing government better. And so I think that what Nabila is talking about too is integrating that kind of data. And the power of that is just enormous. And insights, recommendations, it's, the domain she's talking about, or he is, I apologize, since I'll just say they are, the domain is agriculture, but just put any domain in that. And you can find those crosswalks, find those cross linkages that are incredibly important and powerful.
Thanks, Paul. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. I think we touched on many of the questions that were there. Obviously, there were some questions that we didn't get to. We'll try and answer those offline, but thank you to our panelists and attendees for participating in today's discussion. If you're interested or would like to get involved in ATARC's Growing Good in Government or AI working groups, please reach out to workinggroups@atarc.org. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.